It's Wednesday, so you all know what that means. It's another edition of GC Live here on Gamecock Central. Kendall Smith and Jack Veltri coming at you here. Jack, how we doing on this Wednesday afternoon?
Doing great, Kendall. It is, it's starting to feel like the new year finally. I know we talked about that a bit last week, but feels like everything is finally coming together now. And yeah, how are you doing?
I'm well. I'm doing great. It's cold and chilly here in Charlotte, but other than that, doing well. Jack, I'm curious. You say it sounds and feels more like the new year now here in 2025. I feel like it's been 2025 for months. I don't know why, but I think because I work in baseball, we talk so much about the 2025 season that I've just been thinking about 2025 for so long. But for you, what was your New Year's resolution? We haven't talked about this yet on the
Oh
show.
gosh, I don't even know if I really had one, to be honest. I don't know. I don't really think about that stuff. Just being better than was last year. I guess that's pretty simple. What about you?
It's a good one. For me, I try not to get too much into resolutions, but just trying to do, a few things here and there. I've really been into working out a ton recently. So just keeping up with that. I feel like I did a pretty good job with that last year. So just trying to keep up with that a little bit here in the new year. But yeah, Happy New Year to you all. I feel like we're getting to the point where we can stop saying Happy New Year because we are over 2 weeks now into 2025. But it has been a busy year for the South Carolina Gamecocks, and we're going to talk about that here on the show today. A little bit of transfer portal, and then we mostly talk about football here on the show, but today we're going to talk a little bit of hoops as well, women's and men's basketball for South Carolina. Two different seasons so far for those groups, we will say, just to start things off. But before we get into talking about all of those different topics, Jack, we have an amazing sponsor here of GC Live that we want to give a huge shout out to.
Yeah, right above us here, as always, Clint Hammond of CMG Home Loans. If you are in the market to potentially buy a home or you need help with your mortgage, but you don't know where to begin, Clint is your guy to call. He'll take you through the process step by step, and he'll show you what to do. He's been in the mortgage industry for more than 20 years. He's a lifelong Gamecock fan, and of course, he's a longtime supporter of Gamecock Central. And you'll see him right above us here on all of our GC Live shows. If you're interested, give him a call, 803-422-6797. The NMLS number for him is 71597, or you can go to clinthammond.com.
All right, Jack, let's talk transfer portal to kick things off, because it wouldn't be GC Live if we didn't talk about football at least a little bit here on the show. Yeah. Obviously, it is the off season, but things keep on moving for South Carolina. You've got the portal. You've got another signing day coming up in February, and then you will have yet another portal window that will open up after spring practice, and we'll obviously talk about spring practice a ton here on the show as it gets a little bit closer, but South Carolina picking up some guys in the portal, a couple actually, over the last few days to kind of round out this portal class that they were able to put together. So let's take it broad to start, and then we'll kind of narrow it into some specific players. But Jack, what are your overall impressions of what South Carolina was able to do in the transfer portal during this period of time?
Well, coming into the portal cycle, we knew obviously that we're going to have a ton of holes to fill. I mean, that's kind of the trade-off of returning so many different players from last season's team, different starters, veteran players. You knew eventually their time was going to come to an end. You were going to have to fill those voids. And I think you've been able to do so for the most part. You really replenished on the offensive line, bringing in a trio of guys. Defensive line, you've also been able to do that, bringing in a few guys. I feel like you've been able to do that pretty much everywhere. You brought in a pair of linebackers. You brought in some DBs. You only got one edge rusher. I think that's something where, if we end up talking about a little bit more of what we think South Carolina could have done more of, I think the edge would have been nice to get another proven guy in there, just because you want someone that you know is going to be up to the standard of a Dylan Stewart or, what Kyle Kennard was for this team in 2024. But we'll see what happens with Jaylen Brown and returning Brian Thomas Jr., guys like that. But honestly, I felt really good about what they were able to do. I feel like they've plugged in a lot of the holes that maybe they were lacking a little bit of depth in. And of course, you'll have the high school guys coming in too and stuff. So feeling good about where things are at. Heck, you even got a backup quarterback in Aaron Nolan from Ohio State that you could potentially have as the heir to Lenoris Sellers whenever Lenoris' time comes to an end at Carolina. But overall, feeling good about where things are at with how they address certain needs. Now it's just about, okay, how does it translate over to the field? Because that's an entirely different thing compared to what your roster looks like on paper right now.
Yeah, and I think, something that should be noted about this transfer portal class is that South Carolina really was able to win some big time recruiting battles for a lot of these guys. And we talk about this so often, not only here on the show, but obviously on the recruiting rundown that Wes and I do. And I know you all talk about it all the time, whether it's here, whether it's on the radio. South Carolina winning those battles. I mean, that is so key for this program as it continues to grow and continues to move up in the ranks in the national scale of when we talk about college football. So some really quality pickups for the Gamecocks, and a couple actually, like we mentioned, over the last few days that I'd like to specifically talk about here on the show. Devontae Miles and then Brandon Cisse as well. Miles is a defensive lineman. He's going to join from Bowling Green, and then defensive back, like I said, Brandon Cisse from NC State. A couple of big pickups, and those guys kind of rounding out the class here, I guess, for South Carolina. So what are your thoughts on those two, Jack?
Yeah, I think I'll start with Cisse because I think that's probably the more interesting one because it happened more recently. But getting him from NC State, that's a big deal alone on its own to add another DB to that room. And obviously, I think the secondary is probably the one area on this team where I feel like they got a lot of pieces returning. Obviously, it starts with Jalen Kilgore. We'll see if he ends up playing like the nickel. You're obviously losing Nicky Minwari, but you're returning DQ Smith. You'll have Judge Collier, Peyton Williams, Bakari Swain, all those guys back. So I wonder how a guy like Cisse and some of these other DBs, like Miles Norwood's another guy they brought in. Obviously, they'll have guys coming in from the high school ranks. I wonder how that's all going to work and if it's like who ends up starting and whatnot. Because you didn't bring these guys in just to be bench warmers or anything. And obviously, as we saw this season, depth is very important, and a lot of guys will get opportunity. But the interesting thing is, obviously, we saw on social media, Lane Kiffin, the Ole Miss head coach, had posted that he was in Sumter the other day. And when he seemingly does that, he's a little bit of a troll. When he does that, it's like, okay, well, he's probably going to end up landing Cisse here because we've seen this story before. But it ended up being South Carolina getting him. And that's a really big deal because, number one, he's an in-state kid. So obviously, he went to NC State, but he'll be at his home state school now. And you keep him away from an SEC school that tends to really stack up in the transfer portal. So big deal right there. We'll see how he translates over to the SEC in Carolina. Like, he played for NC State this year as a sophomore and had 28 tackles and no interceptions or anything. But, 5 pass deflections seems pretty good. So I'm liking what they got with him. We'll see more of what he can bring. And then you got from Bowling Green, Devontae Miles, like you said, Kendall, defensive lineman. Didn't do much this year, only 11 tackles. And I feel like, that might worry people. But honestly, we know South Carolina can develop players. Like, just because you didn't perform or have the biggest numbers at a different school doesn't mean you can't come here and be a stud. I mean, obviously South Carolina is pretty good at developing talent and finding those diamonds in the rough. So I have no doubt that someone like Travian Robertson will be able to definitely develop Miles. We'll see what the role ends up being for a lot of these guys, but I feel really good about where South Carolina was able to fill voids on the defense, especially at two positions, secondary and defensive line, where you obviously need some more pieces out there.
Yeah, that's what the portal is all about, obviously filling those voids and making sure you're in a good spot as you head into spring practice. And then, of course, we won't even talk about it right now, but there will be another period in which the transfer portal will open back up. So South Carolina could make some moves there and then obviously could potentially lose some guys to the portal as well. But only time will tell to see what happens with that. Glad to hear, though, Jack, that you're pretty satisfied with what South Carolina was able to do with the portal this year. You have, portal winners, portal losers. South Carolina, I feel like, did a pretty good job. I would concur with what you're saying right there. When you look at this list, though, of commitments, Jack, which player, and maybe you can name two, I won't just make you name one, but which player stands out to you as the one where you're like, yeah, I'm pretty pumped about this player. I feel like South Carolina did a good job with that.
Feels like there's a few on this list, but if I'm really narrowing it down, I would probably say, if there's two in particular, I would say Bo Stanley from Troy, the offensive lineman who committed pretty recently here and signed. He's interesting because, yes, he gave up a ton of quarterback pressures, if I'm not mistaken, but he also only allowed, I think, 2 sacks, and that is pretty impressive to say the least. But the interesting thing about him is that he's played multiple positions on the offensive line. And yes, most guys can, but this is a guy that's played tackle. He's played center. I mean, playing center, I feel like is probably the hardest position on the line because you not only have to snap the ball, but you're also responsible for, blocking and being the captain of the offensive line. So that's no easy task there. I think the other name that obviously stands out to a lot of people here is probably Rasul Faison. I think the running back from Utah State. I'm very interested to see how he translates over to USC. We'll see if he ends up being the lead back. Me personally, I think it's going to be a rotation of Faison and Attaway or Oscar Attaway as the one at running back. Maybe depending on the situations, we'll see what happens. And then obviously you got Jawarn Howell and Matthew Fuller behind those guys. So bringing in a guy like Faison, you missed out on Justice Haynes, who ended up committing to Michigan, and that was the guy they were definitely going after, it seems. But you're able to get someone else who is pretty highly regarded in the portal. So all in all, I think there's a lot of different guys you could definitely name here, but the two in particular, losing someone like Rocket Sanders, that's a huge loss. You get Faison to replace him potentially here. And then you have Vershawn Lee leaving, and you have Bo Stanley, who could potentially, we'll see if he ends up playing center or tackle, whatever position on the line. But that's someone that can play center. That's a good thing to have there.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment 100%. South Carolina filling some important voids. And when you lose a guy like Rocket Sanders, obviously you need to make sure that you're bringing in someone that people are excited about. And I think with Faison, and, we received this feedback, obviously, on Gamecock Central, but on the recruiting rundown as well. People are very excited about him. You get that buzz around certain players, especially with the portal, and people that fans really want to come to your school. And I feel like that was really the vibe that I got about Faison. Obviously, South Carolina and the staff very excited to have him, but the fan base was really talking about that one. So good for South Carolina to be able to get things done, because it is not easy. And I feel like we talk about it sometimes, but we don't talk about it enough, how difficult it is to recruit in the transfer portal and just to coach in this current age of college football. But we've seen the way that Shane Beamer has really been able to really connect with a lot of these players and get them to want to come and play for the Gamecocks. And, another example of that is Cisse. You talked about Ole Miss and how there was a little bit of back and forth there, and you're going head to head with the school that's on the rise that, didn't have as great of a season as they wanted to, but still had a pretty good season. You got Lane Kiffin trolling you on X, and you still managed to get it done. And that's a guy who is from Sumter, an in-state guy. We've seen South Carolina succeed with in-state recruiting, not just at the high school level, but, it's nice to see that transfer, no pun intended, to the transfer portal. You're getting a little bit of both, the high school and the transfer portal level as well, getting some of these guys that maybe didn't get that initial offer from South Carolina when they were coming out of high school, but have proven themselves at the college level and are guys that South Carolina wants to bring in. Also, guys from big time programs. You look at Ohio State, NC State, Wake Forest, Missouri. I mean, those are just a couple of the schools that South Carolina was able to get players from, and those are big time, big name programs. So that's another thing about it. But, even some of those smaller schools, like we said, you get guys from those smaller schools that really, really impress and come up to the SEC level and play for South Carolina and do a fantastic job. So, Jack, I know that I asked you this last week and you said you wouldn't be able to answer it then because you didn't really have a clear idea of exactly how this would end for South Carolina. But now that we have a pretty clear picture of how the transfer portal went, how would you grade it for the Gamecocks?
Okay. I think
now you have to answer it this week. You can't say
yeah. Well, it seems like everything is pretty much, unless there's some surprise commitment randomly, I think this is about what the portal class is going to look like. I think overall, I would give it about a B. I think you've been able to fill the main positions you need to fill. The offensive line, the defensive line, bringing in a tight end too. We'll see if he ends up replacing like a Josh Simon, but Jordan Dingle from Kentucky. You got a few DBs to come in. You got some linebackers, and you got a running back, and you even got a quarterback. So, look, would you want to add more? Yes, obviously. Like, you would want to maybe bring in another edge, like I said. More defensive linemen would not hurt, even though you've definitely done your work in getting a few guys in here. So, yeah, I think a B sounds about right. And the good thing about, you mentioned what, with Shane and stuff, doing a great job of recruiting in-state talent and stuff, and just players in general. I saw Chris Clark on Gamecock Central posted a good story the other day. I would suggest going to read. It's called Insider Report: Nuggets on South Carolina Portal Gets. in that story, he wrote about how, he was talking to someone, and basically all the players, met with Garnet Trust and stuff, and had time to sit down and kind of talk with them and stuff. And the main message was, why'd you come to South Carolina and stuff? And because it felt like home, and this is the place to be. So you hear commits and signees and players, new players come to South Carolina saying that. I think that's very impressive, and it shows that South Carolina is doing their due diligence to go get the right guys that fit their system, but are also about the right thing. So yeah, a B sounds about right. Always want to get more, but with what they got in this, it feels like it's a short amount of time. Quite honestly, it flies by with how fast the portal opens and closes. But South Carolina did a very good job, I thought, this portal cycle.
I feel like it didn't fly by at all. I feel like it did not fly by. I think that's because Wes and I were just so tapped into everything. And obviously you are too, but like literally by the minute, like Wes was always texting me, things are going on. Of course, we have the recruiting rundown as well. I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time. I don't know. I'd be curious to ask the coaches, do you feel like it flew by? Because for them, they're just constantly like going throughout that cycle. But does that feel fast, or does that feel slow to them?
It's gotta be slow, just because they're so busy and locked. We talk about what Gamecock Central does with Wes, Chris, you with all the recruiting stuff. These guys are doing it so much more. They're the ones that have to go, try to talk these guys into coming to South Carolina, and they deal with the ups and downs of it. So it's probably a much longer, excruciating process that some guys I'm sure like, some probably don't. It's I don't love the portal with how just chaotic it is, but that's the name of the game.
Well, the good news is South Carolina's coaching staff has some really natural recruiters. And I think that has certainly paid off. Coaches that a lot of players can really relate to. And like I said, connect to. And that's why they want to come to South Carolina. And something about South Carolina is they don't change what the dynamic of the program is to fit any specific player. They really want these guys to come into the program, as you mentioned, that will really fit what South Carolina is trying to build. And as they try to grow as a program, I think we're seeing that more and more and more, which is a great thing. But, Jack, you gave it a B, and that's why I think it's great. You give the honest answers, right? Someone could have sat there and said A+. It was an A+ transfer portal period for South Carolina. But I think we know, there are always a couple of things that could have been improved on. And I think any team across the country, even if you're getting ranked as the winner, the best, the number one team with the transfer portal during this past period, there are still things you could have improved on. So why a B instead of an A? What could South Carolina have done a little bit differently that you think would have maybe given them a bump up on your grading scale?
Again, I think it just comes down to, all right, you filled out the potential starting spots. I think is more like the three offensive linemen. I expect them to be competing for starting jobs in 2025, no doubt. Obviously Aaron Nolan, quarterback, he's probably going to be sitting as a backup to Lenore Sellers, barring any injury or anything. You brought in mostly outside of the quarterback position. I think you brought in pretty much all guys who are going to be potentially starting at South Carolina, if not on day one, pretty soon. I get that vibe from you brought these guys in for a reason, right? The thing is, you have 13 commits, and I know there are schools out there with plenty more commits, probably in the 20s and stuff. But I think my point is that South Carolina, and I don't know what they could have done differently. I feel like more depth is never a bad thing. We saw that this year with so many different things happening. I think South Carolina was pretty good with the whole injury bug and stuff. But there were times where, someone went down in the game. You had to have someone else step up. I always think back to, obviously, the Citrus Bowl is the good example with Peyton Williams having to come in for Nicky Minwari in the second half. And then Peyton Williams having a great game against Vanderbilt in November. So it's stuff like that. It's just one example. There's always been other moments where guys have stepped up and stuff. But the name of the game with this team in 2024 that made them so successful was that you could plug and play. You could put in different guys in different situations, rotate them in and out, and you were going to get pretty much the same, if not exactly the same type of production nearly every week. So I wonder how South Carolina is going to be able to do with how they're going to be able to handle that. Maybe some of these guys will be depth pieces. We'll see. Maybe some of the high school guys they're bringing in are going to, kind of help fill that void a little bit. But I think what they did in the portal was very good. You got a lot of guys I think that could definitely help you out, not just this year, but very long-term speaking. And that's always what you want to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a good question here. You talk about maybe bringing in some of these guys to be impact players right off of the bat. Some of them might take a little bit more time to develop into those roles for South Carolina. But when you look at what we have with the transfers in this specific cycle, who do you think will be the most impactful transfer?
That's tough to say. I'm not sure because if you look at it just right away, 1-year scenario, let's just, obviously all these guys' situations are different, but a lot of these players you're bringing in, have that 1 year of eligibility left, and some will have 2 and more and all that. But just speaking on 2025, I feel like it's got to be, I mentioned him earlier, I feel like it's got to be Faison. I think he is a guy that could definitely be very, very impactful for South Carolina in the immediate future here. But long-term speaking, I think, and I'm going to butcher his name here. I'm still getting used to it. But the linebacker from Alabama, Justin Okonkwo, I don't know how to pronounce his name yet. I'll get there eventually. But I've heard so many good things about Justin and just the way, he's a guy that many people have said could just easily be a 5-star recruit when he was, going through his, commitment process out of high school and stuff. And he's from Alabama, obviously, played there. And I think he's a guy that a lot of people are super high on. And I'm excited to see what he can do for the long-term future.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that one. I would have said Faison as well, just right off the bat, because you do talk about those immediate needs that you need filled. There's obviously a chance for somebody to step up. And, I think for a running back, right, you think about those skill positions right off of the bat, you're going to notice that. But some of these linemen, I think as well, really have a chance to come in and be immediate impacts. And we probably don't talk about that enough. Some of the most underappreciated positions on a football team are linemen, specifically offensive linemen. So I always want to give them a shout out too. So I think, some of these guys that South Carolina was able to get during this cycle that are linemen, that was obviously a gap that South Carolina needed to fill. I'm excited about that. But I think when you look at, where South Carolina needed somebody, Faison's coming in for a guy like Rocket Sanders, who was so impactful this past year for South Carolina. I think he really has a chance to kind of lead that position group and be that guy this season. So we appreciate the question. Absolutely. And Jack, anything else that we want to add here on the transfer portal before we switch gears to talking about basketball for the first time this whole season?
I know. I'm excited to start talking some hoops. We do have a question here about anything we were hearing on the wide receivers from Penn State. I haven't heard too much, obviously, right now, just because obviously the cycle is kind of coming to an end and stuff. But obviously, Penn State's season ended just a few days ago. I have seen a few guys from the receiving corps out in Penn State have entered the portal, but right now, maybe Wes or Chris can, provide something different on this on Gamecock Central, but haven't seen anything on, that right now. So that's really all I have to add. I think they did a great job though, this portal cycle. Like if this is what the final class looks like, and again, the spring will obviously, they'll get more guys. I'm sure they did that last season with bringing guys like Dale Von Campbell and Vandravius Jacobs, players like that. I think they did really good. And speaking of wide receivers, maybe that is the only other position I would say South Carolina could have used another guy. But here's a good point from EXO here, who says, South Carolina has great young wide receivers, but wouldn't have minded a more proven guy. I definitely understand that, but at the same time, you have these young receivers for a reason. I think this is the year where you see more of those guys step up. Some of them will be in their second year, like Mazeo Bennett, Dre Jacobs, players like that will get a chance to really flourish. And maybe this homegrown talent you brought in, all these incoming freshmen, can really step up and be the heart of what you do at receiver for years to come.
Yeah, the way that the roster is right now, you expect South Carolina to lean on a lot of those younger guys at the wide receiver position, which is a good thing because it's always hard to balance it, right? And now in the transfer portal era, you can have a chance to add these veteran guys to your group, which is always extremely helpful to have guys that do have a lot of experience playing at a very high level in college football. But in some ways, it's about the balance of being able to let some of those young guys really step up to the plate and have those opportunities. And maybe that's a reason why South Carolina didn't go as hard after wide receivers, specifically in this transfer portal period, because they do want to lean a little bit more on those younger guys. That's what we're hearing. And that seems to be the case as the roster sits right now. But obviously, things could certainly change for South Carolina. Once again, that spring window will open up. And yes, that should be interesting as well, because as we always say, the portal taketh and it giveth. And after spring practice, you get a lot of questions answered. And, some guys realize they don't want to be a part of the program anymore. And that's where things get very interesting. So we will be talking about this all once again in just a few months. But Jack, we got another sponsor to give a shout out to.
That's right, Kendall. Our second sponsor of the day, PrizePicks, which is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in all of North America. They're the easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. So instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections. And then, of course, watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks has quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. It's what makes PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. I've used PrizePicks plenty in the past and still do to this day, and it is it's a lot of fun right now. You got college football going on. The NFL playoffs are in the thick of things. You got the NBA, NHL. I mean, the options, soccer, college basketball, PGA. I mean, the options are endless. There's so many different sports to pick from. So definitely a great place to go if you're interested. So if you are, just go to PrizePicks.com, download the PrizePicks app, and use the code on-screen GC, that stands for Gamecock Central, to receive a guaranteed $50 once you play $5 in lineups.
Before we start talking about college hoops, it's a perfect time to give a couple of predictions. You talk about the NFL in full swing with the playoffs right now. And then obviously we have the college football national championship coming up this Monday in Atlanta, Georgia. The Ohio State Buckeyes and the Notre Dame Fighting Irish going head to head. Should be a good one. So let's start with that. Who do you think is going to win, Jack? Have you sent out our picks for the week? Are we been?
I'm gonna be sending that out today. Thank you.
It's just one pick, so everybody should get
one game. It's just one game. I'm thinking Ohio State's going to win this game. I would like Notre Dame to win, but I think Ohio State is just way too talented, and there's a reason why they're the favorite in this game. So I'm taking the Buckeyes probably.
Yes, I will agree with that as well. I'm going to go with Ohio State on this one. And, I think it just is exactly what you said. The talent on that team is unbelievable. Everything that is thrown Jeremiah Smith's way, he catches. And he says that. He's like, you know what? I'll go with anybody one-on-one. And he certainly can. I mean, one of the most talented freshmen I have seen in a long, long time at the college football level. I think he is incredibly talented. Obviously, you got Will Howard as well. But Riley Leonard will have something to say about that. And we get to see Mitch Jeter, too. I always like to see his dad in the stands when he has his camera. I think that's the best thing. Like, you have all of the cameras from ESPN, these high-quality cameras. Your son's on TV. You could easily go back and just rewatch it. But he's got his camera and he's holding it up and he's videoing his son. So that's always cool to be able to see that. But I'm excited about this matchup on Monday. I'm sad the college football season is coming to an end, but hopefully we get a good game. That's all I can ask for at this point. Just a good game. I don't necessarily want it to be a blowout game.
No, so, never again with that 65-7 stuff from the Georgia TCU national championship. Never again. Make it competitive. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, exactly. We want a competitive game. All right. How you feeling? Your Bills and the Ravens this weekend, and then we'll get to hoops.
I'd be lying.
Game. I'm excited. I think that's the one I'm the most excited for this weekend.
The best game of the weekend, I think. I would be lying if I said I was not a little bit afraid. Me personally, I've said it all week. I think the Ravens are the team to beat in this playoffs. Like, they are just such a stacked team. Bringing in Derrick Henry was the move for them, and it's obviously paid dividends. So I know the Bills have struggled with slowing down Henry before. Going to be interested to see if they can do so this weekend. We'll see, but I'm really looking forward to it. But my concern is there for sure. We'll see.
Well, I hope it's a good game as well. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a Bills fan. I'm not a fan, but I want it for the fan base. Like, I really do want it for the fan base. Like, I appreciate that Buffalo fan base. I think it's a great group. So I'm just hoping for a good game. None of my teams are in the playoffs. So I'm
Nah,
just hoping for good
boo.
football. That's all that I want. Good football, and that's hopefully what we will get. But no more football here. Let's turn the page and talk about some hoops, women's and men's basketball in full swing. And like I mentioned at the top of the podcast, these two groups having very different seasons so far. The women continue to roll right along. Unfortunately, an unexpected loss a little bit earlier in the season, but since then they have been steady and dominant as usual, just things that we expect out of the South Carolina women's basketball program. And for the men, it's been a little bit of a rocky road here at times, some ups, some downs, more recently some downs, unfortunately. And Jack, you have been at all of the games, covering all of the games. You've really been the one that's been in the thick of things here for GamecockCentral.com, covering men's basketball. As it stands right now, how would you describe the state of the season for the men's team?
Well, considering they took Auburn down to the wire and had the lead going into the final 2 minutes, it could be worse. It could be a lot worse. You could have gotten hammered and blown out, whatever, by Auburn, but you took them down to the wire. So it shows there is a pulse at the very least. Now, what are you going to do with that moving forward? You got Vanderbilt later tonight in Nashville, then you go to Oklahoma on Saturday. The schedule has been very tough coming right out of the gate. You played Mississippi State on the road, got killed, blown up by 35. I think that was South Carolina's worst game of the year, easily by far. That first half of basketball was the most non-competitive thing I've seen all year from this team. Then you got the Alabama game where you started nice, but then things kind of just slowly started to crumble a little bit. And then that Auburn game, no one really had expectations, but South Carolina did play pretty well. They just got to be able to finish. That's the thing. You can't end the game with missed free throws and a 5-minute scoring drought. That is not going to cut it. But the good news is you've got your Alabama teams out of the way. You don't have to play Alabama and Auburn again this regular season. We'll see what happens this week. Vanderbilt and Oklahoma are much more – you're not going to be favored in any of these games, but I will say they're much more favorable matchups that you can win. I don't think Vanderbilt has a tremendous home court environment, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's Vanderbilt, but we'll see. You know, we've been proven wrong before, obviously. And then Oklahoma on Saturday. I'm not sure what to expect either, EXL, because Oklahoma is this team that was unbeaten through non-conference play. Then they got smacked by Alabama, and then they've lost 2 more games in SEC play to be in the same boat that South Carolina is in. So I think Oklahoma is very fraudulent. And I think, look, a lot of people are going to be checked out on this team and all that, thinking the season's over. They've lost 3 games. Oh, this team stinks, all this and that. I think there's still a path to get, to the tournament potentially, or at least get in the conversation. You get somewhere about, as Jeff 2001 says here, you get somewhere between 8 wins and finishing 500 or better in conference play. You're at about 500 and you have about 20 wins by that point. You're South Carolina. I think you feel pretty good about your chances of making the tournament. And I think with how good this conference is in basketball this year, I mean, it's easily the best in college basketball this season. I think South Carolina would have a chance, but it's so easier said than done. You have to win. Ideally, you'd like to win both games this week. You win, you split. That's okay, but you still have such a long way to go.
Yeah, the Auburn game was an absolute heartbreaker to watch, as mentioned in these comments. Just so tough when, you are in it, as South Carolina was, and then obviously gets down to the end of that game and South Carolina wasn't able to pull off the win. But like you said, I guess the positive side of that is that South Carolina was able to hang in there for that long, and that's definitely huge for the group. And you said, maybe a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. There might be a chance for South Carolina to potentially be in the conversation for the tournament, which obviously is the goal for this group. But Jack, when you look at this men's basketball team and what you've been able to watch so far throughout the season, you talked about obviously being able to finish games, but what is it that you think this team needs to tap into? What do they need to do here to really have that strong finish, as you talked about?
Yeah, well, with 15 games left, we've learned a lot about this team already through SEC play. I think they've already been battle tested. That Auburn game was excruciating for them to lose. I don't know if they were going to win that game by the end. I always had that feeling in the pit of my stomach, like this is not going to go South Carolina's way. Like they're not there yet, at least in my opinion. But look, the good thing that we learned from that game is that when they play with aggression and physicality, they are such a better basketball team. When they are crashing the boards, grabbing rebounds over other teams, winning the rebound battle is so big in basketball, and you're holding teams to 60 points. Like you held Auburn, a team that has been dominant this season, to 66 points. That's the benchmark for where you need to be at in every game. You hold teams to 60 points like you did last year, and you're doing the other things right, like playing aggressive and physical, and hopefully you get some shooting. Hopefully the shooting's a little bit better here. You need more consistency there, but I know you're down a few guys right now that are some of your better shooters, but you figure those things out. You have a recipe for success, in my opinion. But I think South Carolina, the aggression and physicality, that was something that I definitely felt like was lacking for pretty much all of the season until that Auburn game. The way those guys played right out of the gate, swarming defensively, grabbing rebounds, doing the little things right, it makes such a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, South Carolina still has a chance here at the end of the season. Don't write them off quite yet because Lamont Paris and his group eager to get back to it. They've got a big game here tonight, a big game against Vanderbilt. Jack, you didn't want to go to Nashville? You've been complaining.
All right. So here's the backstory behind it. So I was at Mississippi State on January 4th for that game, right? I spent the entire weekend there. I would not recommend going to Starkville. It's so isolated from everything. It feels like nice little college town, but still, that's not the point. As soon as South Carolina lost by 35, I messaged you and I'm like, we had plans for me to go out to Nashville for the Vanderbilt game. As soon as I saw the way they performed, and honestly, after the Alabama game too, I was just like, you know what? Don't worry about me going to Vanderbilt. I'll just cover the game from home. It'll be a lot easier. And that way, I don't need to go experience that again because when the team starts playing a little better and it makes more sense to travel, like, Kentucky's coming up, I would like to go to that. But if South Carolina is not playing particularly great, it would be easier to save the mileage. Baseball's coming up too. Got to be traveling for that. So you got to keep these things in mind when it's like this. But obviously, like Georgia, I'll go to and stuff. And I'll probably go to Tennessee at the end of the year. But yeah, Vanderbilt, I was like, yeah, that's a no-go. Not right now, at least.
Well, I figured you didn't want to go because you said you're tired of Nashville. Anytime we would speak of the Music City Bowl, Jack was like, no, I'm not going to Nashville. I don't want to go there. I've been there too much.
Well, I got to go back in a few months anyway because we got a question here. I've seen this type of question thrown around a lot, and the SEC tournament is back in Nashville, so I'll have no choice whenever South Carolina gets there. The thing is, people are confused about this because I think the old format was, I think it was the bottom two teams in the SEC in the standings did not make the tournament. That is different. But just like with baseball, all 16 teams will be going to the SEC tournament regardless of record. So South Carolina will have a tournament game of some sort in March. Probably maybe not the NCAA tournament, but for sure the SEC tournament. So, they're going to be in there. It's just who's the must win to make it. Like to get a better seed maybe is the better question to ask here. I don't know. They just got to get to about that 8, 9, 10 win mark because then that guarantees you a little bit of hope to maybe make the tournament. But yes, I will be back in Nashville at some point this year, whether I want to go or not. The SEC tournament's always a fun time. So
it's not that bad, Jack. Nashville is fun. I know you've been a lot, but you have to explore places beyond Broadway.
Oh, I know.
Past Broadway. That's so fun.
I know. Look,
we gotta get to the recommendation.
Anytime I go to Nashville, it's always my friends or coworkers or whoever like, oh, let's go to Broadway. I'm just like, whatever. I got no saying. Hey, if I go,
wait. Didn't you go to Halls the last time you were there?
Yeah, I did. I had never been to Halls, and I was like, you know what? It's here. And a friend recommended. I'm like, all right, we're going, and it was so good. Got to do the bar menu. It is the way to go.
I think when I was going on road trips for Gamecock Central, I was going to McDonald's.
That's what we do.
Wendy's.
That's what we do 99.9% of the time. But considering South Carolina had just gotten bowl eligible, I'm feeling like, all right, let me ask you. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So I don't ever do that. So
I will never forget. We were on a road trip. I think it may have been to Nashville. It may have been to Lexington, though. It was one of those two. And CJ, our photographer, was driving with us, and we're driving and we're hungry. And we stop at a Zaxby's Bojangles. They're like, all right, let's stop at Bojangles. This is what we want. So we stop at Bojangles, and I get out and I order a salad from Bojangles. And I did not live that down for the rest of the trip wherever we were going. They're like, I can't believe you ordered a salad from Bojangles. Like, CJ will never let me forget it to this day. So
yeah, but if you're trying to eat healthy, it's tough on the road because you got to eat. Like, sometimes you can eat all this garbage and stuff, but eating all this fast food and stuff, it's just not good. Like, it gets so old. So you gotta mix it up a little bit. So I don't blame you at all. So
yeah, well, now I'm like pretty much eating like strictly carnivore. So if I was really on the road like that, it would be a lot harder. But yeah, Halls is a huge win. I mean, that is massive. So shout out to Shu for letting you go to Halls. We've had this question up here for a minute. Let's have it be the last question about men's basketball, and then let's switch to women's basketball. Do you see this as a rebuilding year for the team?
I don't know. That's a good question. To some extent, yes. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. The reason I don't view it as a rebuilding year is because you brought in all this talent to replace the starters you lost from last year's team, and you expect them to give you about the same production. Heck, that's what you brought them in for. Like, Nick Pringle played on a Final Four team last year and was pretty good. That is a piece that you brought in to add to having what you lacked last year in a big man that could, besides Colin Murray Boyles, but you don't want him playing at the 5. You put Pringle at the 5, and he's done pretty well, I thought, so far this year. Then Jamari Thomas is the guard you brought in to replace, and this is the issue here, replacing Talon Cooper, the floor general of your team last year, and Michi Johnson, the scorer of your team last year. South Carolina didn't have another guy like that from the portal class, unless I'm like mistaken or something, forgetting someone. I know they've got some guys from last year's team that are back, but you don't have that true scoring guard like a Michi. You have Jamari, but he can't do both, in my opinion. I think look, he was a scorer at Norfolk State. You're asking him to do a little bit of both, and that's where you kind of get into a little bit of trouble. And now that he's hurt, it kind of makes things a little bit worse with how you have to go about the guard position. So right now, as things stand after the season they've had to this point, I still don't think it's a full rebuilding year. It's more so just you're going to miss on some recruiting and all that. Like, that's natural. Like, it's just like football. Every time you think you got a great player, it's not always going to be that way. Not saying it hasn't been this year, but just a lot of things have kind of happened to where the SEC is significantly better across the board. I mean, every team is better than South Carolina in basketball right now, pretty much, maybe besides Arkansas, who's 0-4 in conference play. But like, this is a very tough conference. That doesn't help. It doesn't help that South Carolina also lost 3 starters who provide not just significant minutes and different abilities on the court, experience. There's nothing that you can do to replace the experience those guys had. You can bring in anyone you want. Nick Pringle, Final Four guy, like I said, but it's never going to be what they had last year with the different guys that brought the leadership and experience. So to answer the question, I feel like it's a rebuilding year in some ways, but in others, I still feel like this team was good enough and is good enough to get it going. It's just they've had a tough schedule, and no one's denying that. That has definitely been something that has been tough to deal with at the start of this conference play.
We need like another word between rebuilding and obviously having like a stellar year. I'm looking up synonyms.
Like retooling, maybe. Like, I don't even know. Like,
yeah,
I think retooling is the better way to put it, because you brought in the guys to replace those players from last year. It's just it hasn't fully translated. Like, I think Nick Pringle's starting to finally get figured out. Like, he had a double against Auburn and really played to his full potential. Yes, I know he missed the free throws. It's gonna happen. But I think with Jamari and stuff, and it doesn't help that he's hurt. It doesn't help that Miles Studi has been banged up too. And hopefully both those guys get better soon. Miles dealing with the blood clot and all that. But Miles hadn't been performing to the extent that we knew he did last year and all that. And that's the other thing. I think guys are just not performing to their full potential just yet. But maybe that can change Saw Arden Conyers get in, play 31 minutes the other day against Auburn, showed a lot of good things. So you get more of that where guys take advantage of their opportunity and play well. I think things can start trending upwards a little bit.
Well, this is a great comment.
It is a great comment. I have my eyes on it. I'm like, I was gonna. So here's the funny thing: when I went to Mississippi State, I had a vlog like all ready, and then the team lost by 35. I'm just like, I'm not even gonna do this. Like I stopped halfway through.
Didn't you post when South Carolina would lose in football?
So here's the funny thing: South Carolina hadn't lost. The first vlog I posted was the Oklahoma game. After that, they hadn't lost again in the regular season. So I was a perfect 6-0. And then the Citrus Bowl happened, and that was the first time they lost. I still posted it, and obviously the views suffered because of that. I wish you guys would watch even if they lost, but it was a great time out in Orlando. But yeah, so we'll continue it. Maybe we'll bring it back up for baseball season there. But basketball, unless I'm going on some really cool road trip, maybe Kentucky in a few weeks at Rupp, but we'll see.
Well, Jack, it's interesting because I think the Citrus Bowl, obviously you say the views suffered. It was New Year's Eve, so you should have vlogged like your entire New Year's.
I did. I put it all in there. I did. And the problem was I posted
Obviously, I haven't watched it either. So I'm
Yeah. I posted it on like the 2nd or the 1st, whatever day it was. I was giving it a little bit of room to breathe, but whatever. Next time I hope they win the Citrus Bowl, and that way the views are good. But thank you for all of you who decided to watch.
Well, Wes and I could have vlogged when we were at Disney Springs on New Year's Eve, and we got tired at 10 o'clock and said, bye.
Yeah.
It's good to see you. Yeah. That's the fun part about getting older, I guess. I didn't even want to sleep until midnight. I'm like, I'm out. But yeah, the vlogs are great. Definitely go watch them for sure. But Jack is living his best influencer life right now. We're expecting that to continue here, even through basketball season and baseball season as well. All right, let's talk about women's basketball. They just continue to shine, and Dawn Staley doing what Dawn Staley does, just putting together teams that are so impressive. And like we talked about, the tough loss towards the beginning of the season, but since then, South Carolina just continues to roll on. It is so beyond impressive, this group. And I mean, what really can you say other than the fact that South Carolina is just absolutely dominant in women's basketball? It's so much fun to watch. But with this group specifically this year, and obviously, a lot of people had to step up and fill roles. We talk about that with other teams. That's certainly the case for South Carolina women's basketball this season. What have you been most impressed by with Dawn Staley's team?
Just the way they are still able, even when you think this team maybe isn't, obviously being 38-0 last year is going to be tough to do again. And I think that loss to UCLA, you mentioned it earlier, that being a tough loss for them. I think that was probably the best thing to happen to them, just because you never want to lose, especially to a team that's ranked number 1 right now. But losing that game with winning 43 in a row before that might have been the thing that woke them up, that basically told them internally, hey, we got this loss out of the way. Now let's really go show out who they are. And they went out, in Fort Myers and just dominated Iowa State and Purdue. And since then, it's pretty much been like that. None of these games have been particularly close in most cases. You have a few games here and there, but in SEC play so far, just the dominance this team plays with. Like I said before, even when you think they aren't as good as they were the year before or whatever, man, this is still South Carolina we're talking about. And guess what? They're still led by Dawn Staley. So the way they performed against Texas, though, that was the game. I think a lot of people have had circled on their calendars this year. Like, they play Texas twice this year. You have to go to Austin later this season. If you lost this game at home the other day on Sunday, would have been like, okay, Texas might end up being the best team in the SEC this season and get that 1 seed and all that sort of stuff. South Carolina, I mean, they won by 17 points. And keep in mind, they did it all without Ashlyn Watkins, who hopefully she recovers quickly with the ACL injury and whatnot. But South Carolina, even when they go through adversity, they've been able to persevere, and we'll see what happens come tournament time. I'm still not 100% sure if this team is going to be repeating or anything. That is so tough to do, especially in March. I know it's a little different with the NCAA tournament for women's, because I feel like there's not as many upsets, but the path to get to the Final Four and all that, it's still very tough. So beating Texas, though, and beating some of these teams you've beaten so far, you got Alabama tomorrow night on the road, and then LSU comes to town next week. Got your work cut out for you, but this team has definitely proven they're more than capable of still being that dominant force in this conference.
Yes, I love how they were able to make that statement. I think that's huge, especially when you get all of that chatter and conversation surrounding a game like Texas, where I think, a lot of people probably wanting Texas to win that game. People that are jealous of South Carolina and what they've been able to create with this program, maybe wanted to see another team have the chance to be at the top, and South Carolina said, nope, that is still our spot. We are top here in this conference, and obviously more conference games to be played. But you talked about that loss to UCLA earlier in the season, obviously the number one team in the country. And you said you feel like that was really a reset for this group, maybe one of the best things that could have happened to them. If you were to put those two teams head to head right now, are you taking South Carolina?
I would say yes, normally. But the one thing I'm still curious to see, because if they match up with a team like UCLA anywhere in the tournament in March, I feel like, because UCLA's got Lauren Betts, obviously really tough, forward, center, whatever you want to call her, the five on the team. I don't know if South Carolina has that type of player that can match up, because again, you lost Camila Cardoso after last season. That was the player that could definitely go up against Lauren Betts. So if you face a team like that in March, or even anywhere else in SEC play, again, I'm not sure. I don't cover the team, so I'm not sure if there are other teams in this conference with a player like a Lauren Betts or anything, that big woman essentially per se at the five. If that's the case, I don't know if South Carolina can beat UCLA, but put them on a neutral court. You don't have to travel across the country. Maybe somewhere out east. I think South Carolina has a fighting chance. They would definitely be more prepared, I would say that. And it would be a much more closer game, because that game against UCLA definitely didn't feel close at times. And I think with Dawn, it's tough to beat her twice in a season. I don't even know the last time anyone's done it, unless it happened recently. I just can't remember. But South Carolina would be so much more prepared for this game. And again, they were coming off that stretch where, yes, the win streak continued, but these were a lot of ugly games that they won, like the Michigan game, NC State, Clemson was an ugly game for a time until they kind of put the beating on. That UCLA game, I've said it before, I'll say it again. It was probably the best thing to happen to this team, just because it allowed them to hit the reset button and figure out, okay, the reality's here. We've lost. We've been conquered. How can we be better moving forward?
Mm-hmm. And we've seen this throughout the years of just, how South Carolina has been able to play some of these teams a little bit earlier on in the season, and that really benefits them as they continue throughout the season and move forward, and obviously head towards the tournament, in which South Carolina hopes to once again have another fantastic performance. They usually do. This group is so much fun to watch, so beyond talented, and it's just a blast year in and year out. The consistency of this team is truly second to none. So shout out to the women's basketball team. Always love to watch them. And I think that does it actually for us here on the show today, Jack. We appreciate all of you tuning in to watch. Once again, we hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. We'll be back here next week with even more, talking more basketball. We'll probably start to get into baseball a little bit here in the next couple of weeks as well. So for Jack Veltri, I'm Kendall Smith. This has been GC Live here on Gamecock Central. We'll